see the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.
Hi, it's Edwin Rutsch, and this is Dialogues on How to Build a Culture of Empathy. And today I'm here with Debbie Custance. Thank you for joining me.
I'm very pleased to. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, so the way I got connected with you is you're from Goldsmith College, Department of Psychology in London.
That's
and
right.
You co-authored a study with Jennifer Mayer. And it's titled, I'll put it up on the screen here, Empathic-like Responding by Domestic Dogs, Canis Familiaris to Distress in Humans, an exploratory study. And so what we want to do is maybe talk a little bit about your study and kind of just hear about it.
Sure.
Oh, great. So can you just tell me what kind of led you to do this study? Oh, before I do that, let me actually just mention you wrote the study and a lot of articles have come out, using that as kind of the basis. And I'd just like to mention some of the titles of these articles, like Dogs Demonstrate Empathy to Crying Strangers. Dogs Show Natural Desire to Comfort Human Companions. Canine Comfort. Does your dog know when you're sad? Domestic dogs display empathic response to distress in humans, and the case for doggone empathy. So,
I like the last one.
Isn't that a good one?
That's great. I haven't seen that one.
Well, tell us, what got you interested in doggone empathy?
Well, I started looking at the dog-human bond because it's a very unusual relationship. We're a symbiotic relationship with dogs having at least lived around humans, and then there's signs of the actual breeding for domestication from about 10 to 15,000 years ago. So it's a very special relationship. And if you talk to owners, they often will say, if I get upset, my dog will come over and try to comfort me. My dog was heartless to this. But we decided, I knew that this work had been done with children, where the mothers of children had pretended to cry. And so I was talking to Jen about this and saying, well, maybe we can do something with dogs that follows some of the methods that have been used with children. And she was actually the one that did all the legwork. She went out and found all the owners and ran the experiment, but we wrote it up together and we talked about the design of the study together. And then I wasn't quite sure what we would get, and I was so surprised that there were 18 dogs in the study and 15 of them responded in a way that you might describe as being consistent with empathy. Most of the reports have gone further than my article did in saying it's definitely empathy. I think there's more work to be done before we can say anything quite that definitive, if we can ever come to an absolutely definitive answer to it from a non-human species. But nonetheless, I was still surprised that they ignored talking, which I wasn't surprised by, but they ignored weird humming for the most part. But if you pretended to cry, 15 out of the 18 of them got up and walked over to the person who was crying. And that strength of response surprised me in the light of my dog's heartlessness.
Your dog was one of the 18 that didn't do it.
Three that didn't respond. My dog was like,
time to get a new dog, maybe. But so maybe we could go through this study, just kind of starting. Kind of, you gave a little bit of a background, I think, about the nature of empathy and so forth, and mentioned some other studies like Franz de Waal, and I saw Nancy Eisenstein, I think,
Eisenberg.
Eisenberg, yes, thank you.
Well, I mean, the first thing that I did was look at some of the literature, and there's some extraordinary literature. Most of the things from chimpanzees, the kinds of things that Franz de Waal talks about, are ad lib observations. It wasn't expected, and then the chimp did something extraordinary. think the most extraordinary one was a female chimpanzee who had picked up an injured bird, and she cradled it and very gently stroked it, took it to an elevated position and gently turned it round, held it by its wings and tried to launch it to fly. And he was talking about that in terms of taking the perspective of the bird, because he understood what the female understood what the bird needed to do. Of course, if you want to be a killjoy, you could say it's just a cool toy, and I know these things fly, can I get it to fly? So that's always the problems with these kinds of observations, is they really look convincing. There's always another interpretation. So dogs, chimpanzees, not too many of them, quite hard to test. Dogs, lots and lots of them, they're everywhere. And it seemed, and dogs have this special relationship, and people are already talking about them behaving in empathic-like ways. So they seem like a really obvious species. But some of the studies I love, one of the studies I particularly like.
So you were talking about Lancashire?
Yeah, the mouse study. So Lang colleagues exposed the mice to two different kinds of distress. They either put them into a situation where they were made hot, or they put them into situations, I think they'd given them something to make them feel ill. And they made sure that the mouse watching was experiencing a different type of distress, and yet they were still able to respond to the distress, but only if the other mouse was someone they knew. So they didn't show kind of distress and discomfort behaviors for another mouse unless it was a mouse that was a friend of theirs, which I think is an extraordinary finding. So I think some of these abilities are fairly basic and found in species that are quite distantly related to us. There's quite a difference between showing discomfort at being exposed to somebody else's distress versus actually approaching them and appearing to offer.
Yeah. So you're really looking, you're really looking into all the different animal studies about empathy. So it's like, people have empathy, and the question is, do animals have empathy? And so you're talking about empathy in rats, empathy in dogs, empathy in chimpanzees. So there's all these studies out there now around that.
Exactly, because people say that empathy is uniquely human. And I certainly think certain types of empathy are very likely to be only something a human can express. So a full cognitive understanding of the cause of another's distress, even if it's different from anything you've ever experienced yourself, but you can still show a response to that, is something which perhaps is beyond what most other species can do. But the question is, what's the basic building blocks of that? And do any other species show things that show that they don't just respond to their own situation, but they can respond to others? Are they connected emotionally to other individuals around them, even in the case of dogs, if it's something that's a different species from them? And I would expect that dogs would respond to distress in others because they're a predator. So if I want a meal and I see a distressed food item, it's really to my advantage to respond to that. But that's not empathy necessarily. And it's certainly not empathy in terms of showing concern, because you want to eat the thing that is showing distress. Of course, when you're responding to humans, it depends how you respond. So if the dog's take an alert posture with a dominant stance, it's a predator-like behavior. So if you cried in front of a dog and it suddenly went stiff and all on alert, you'd say, yes, you're responding to the emotion, but not necessarily showing empathy.
Can I just mention? I have that photo here. You have the four dogs.
Yeah.
I'll just show that. I think that's what you're referring to, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
There's one that is the classic predator alert posture.
That's A, which was the dog with the ears pointed up.
That's it. And the tail's usually up in a dominant stance, and they have this kind of, they stand up on their kind of, not have tippy toes, but as far as they can, they take this very upward stance. Well, it's not really what you would expect a dog. If they're showing concern, you'd expect them to behave in a way that's much more quiet and submissive, ears back, body lowered, tail lowered. And it's that kind of response that we said, well, at least if it's going to be consistent with concern, they should approach in this way. And the vast majority of dogs did.
Can I ask, what is C and D? There's four pictures here. You're talking about
playful. So, and although we showed a play stance where the dog does a kind of play bow and puts its legs down and its kind of tail right up in the air and its bottom right up in the air, really we talked about it in terms of when the dog's playful, they kind of move in an excited manner. And there was one young dog, a puppy, that behaved like that. And then I think the other one was a neutral, where they're not showing anything that's very strong either way in any kind of. And you might expect that for an individual that hasn't very contagiously responded to the distress of another. So they know something's wrong, but they're not particularly moved by it. And certainly you'd say, well, this is a tiny component of empathy, but I think empathy really is that sharing of emotion. You don't only recognize someone else is having an emotion, but you kind of echo it in your own emotional response. And that's a full emotional, empathic response.
How are you defining empathy? Because it looks like you're looking at the empathic concern component. And what are the other components of empathy? How are you kind of breaking it down?
That was one of the hardest things, was coming up with some way to operationalize it. So we kept it within talking about concern. But one of the ways in which you can talk about it in a simple sense of just emotion contagion, where what happens is when you see another upset, you become upset, which I think is one important component, but not full-blown empathy. And you see that in babies. So if a baby is exposed to another baby that's crying, that individual starts to cry too. And so if you don't have that kind of contagious emotional kind of content, I wouldn't say it's what makes empathy very exciting, because what I think should happen and does happen in the course of child development is they start with that basic, oh, I'm upset because you're upset. But then they can show some way of then responding to the other individual. They go beyond their own response and start responding to you if you're showing you're upset. And it's that we were looking at, because we were thinking, well, the dogs could get upset because another individual is upset, but then they would, if they only have emotional contagion, then they should seek help for themselves. I'm upset, and their owner's sitting right there. So they should go over to their owner and I'm upset. So what we did, and this was Jen's suggestion, which I think really made the study very good, is we had both the owner of the dog pretend to cry, but also Jen, as a stranger, the dog had never met her before, also pretended to cry. And we wanted to see how the dogs would respond to that. And we were saying, if all they are is getting upset because they're exposed to somebody else who's upset, and their owner's sitting right there, they should go to their owner. But they didn't. Every single dog that showed any kind of response went to both individuals and went to the stranger.
Can I step back for a second? So you're talking about the definition. As I understand it, with empathy, it's really kind of based on mirror neurons, kind of that response. So in a sense, you're kind of saying that the dog is using its mirror neurons to mirror, it's that the person, and we know that you can kind of empathize with your dog in reverse, right? I mean, if your dog is down, you're kind of like imagining that through your mirror neurons, and so it's also to the dogs. Are their mirror neurons firing like that? And then that's kind of like the first component. And then the second is, what are they going to do about it? Is it that you have a sense of connection and that you want to kind of take some sort of appropriate action then with what you've kind of experienced?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's been a lovely study, which is where what the experimenters made the owner pretend they were in some kind of critical danger. So in one situation, they pretended that they were having a heart attack in front of the dog, and there was a bystander there, somebody who could come to the aid, and they wanted to see would the dog run to the bystander to get help, and the dogs didn't respond in that way, which, if you've ever watched Lassie, they really should be. Timmy stuck down the well.
I used to watch Lassie. Yeah, definitely. I was a big Lassie watcher as a kid. It was like the Sunday program. The family would get together and watch Lassie. So it kind of ages me, I guess.
Me too. And Lassie was always running off when somebody was in trouble to get help. So we were, I should imagine the people who did this study were kind of looking for that lovely response. No, none of the dogs responded that way. And that's quite a tall order thing to do. We saw tiny hints that were very interesting, but it's nothing we could look at systematically, where the dogs would look over their shoulder at the other person in the room. And it very much looked to us anthropomorphically, as if the dogs were like, come on then, she's upset, do something. But when it was systematically done in this study, no, they didn't respond in the way you might expect. So we wanted to see, our problem with the study was, and why we say it's really just an explorative study, is yes, the dogs responded and they tended to go over and they would lick and nuzzle and sometimes try and climb into the lap of the person who was pretending to cry. It really looked consistent with empathy in terms of showing concern, and they had their ears back and their tail down. But as one of the reviewers of the paper very wisely pointed out, you don't know what they would do if you were raucously laughing. The dogs, it might be that just an intense emotional display makes the dog submissive and nervous. And they're approaching because of this. They are responding contagiously to strong emotions, but it's not going to be true empathy unless they're distinguishing between them. So we should have put another condition in where somebody was laughing, and to see if the dogs responded in a different way. Were they more playful? Did they go up in a completely different manner? So that's the next stage, and that's why the journal, I think quite rightly said, really you should say this is just an exploratory study. It's the first step. And it is consistent, but it's certainly not definitive. Something none of the newspapers mentioned. It's very clear in the paper, but you want the splashy headline,
right.
Don't you?
The doggone empathy.
Exactly, which is brilliant.
Well, yeah, I have that photograph there from your study where it actually shows the dog up there nuzzling someone who's kind of pretending, I guess. They're not. They're. Yeah. I mean, I guess the other question is can the dog tell the difference between pretend crying and real crying? You know, I guess that would be another kind of a question.
For ages, I never bothered with the study because a friend of mine, when we were talking about doing the study, was saying, "Oh, I can pretend to cry, my dog just doesn't respond. But if I really cry, he responds really strongly." And so I was like, "Oh, it's not worth trying." And then I thought, well, nothing ventured, nothing gained. And to our surprise, they really did respond. But certainly there are things such as it would be quite nice. None of us actually produce tears. We're not method actors. Mm-hmm. But it would be nice to see. The signal of tears is a very human thing. We are the only species that I can think of or know of that produces tears when we're upset. And whether the dogs would make a distinction and actually have been around us long enough and bred long enough in a kind of human-like condition to respond to tears more strongly than to kind of dry crying, which was what they were being exposed to, is a really important question. And I'm beginning to try, and somebody was telling me there's a chemical difference between real tears and fake tears. And it would be lovely with dogs, amazing sense of smell, to see if they can make some kind of distinction. I have no idea, and I have no idea how you would actually do it, but it's like, oh my goodness, it's CSI like science. I would love to try that. Because you have owners, and we now train dogs, we have owners who are very, very sick, particularly with cancer, who say that their dogs get very concerned and worried around them. And before they were even diagnosed, they were zeroing in on the part of the body that had a tumour. And they now have dogs, if you have skin cancer, who are trained to respond to the smell of the skin, the infected skin. So they are responding to all of these kind of bodily, physiological symptoms. So it'd be interesting to see how they respond to tears.
Mm-hmm.
There's
Yes.
loads of things to look at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's really, you're looking at the empathic concern then, is kind of like it's like we're trying to stimulate some kind of a situation where there's some kind of distress, and
Yeah.
are dogs willing to come over to kind of console? I guess it's kind of like we're talking about consoling behavior. For example, I think it's Franz de Waal has shown with chimpanzees that if they're in a fight, there's a loser and he's all down and out about it, and then other
Mm-hmm.
chimps will come over and actually do kind of a consoling
Yeah.
quality. As I've done, I've done searches on compassion on the internet, just photos about compassion,
Yeah.
and primarily they're about consoling behavior. I mean, it's like someone with their arm over the shoulder of the person who's distressed for any number. The soldier that's distressed, the someone who's financially distressed or has lost someone distressed. There's so many forms of distress, and there seems to be this tendency of people wanting to console and just kind of bring their presence to the person as a way of saying, hey, you're not alone, kind of.
Yeah. And of course, with humans and with little children, they can provide language that shows that they really have some appreciation of the nature of the other's distress. So little children, usually when they're getting into like 2 to 3 years of age, and particularly 3 to 4, they begin to say things that show that they're responding. So they'll say, there, don't worry. The problem with a dog is it can't do that. It can't say, yes, yes, I feel your pain. And so you have to do more controls and try more different scenarios in order to try and zero in on what their behavior means. And that was the problem with this first attempt is, yes, it's all consistent, but we would like to look at things like, what about different forms of distress? How about pain? So if you're pretending to stub your toe, or if you're feeling sick, how are the dogs responding to these different signals? I've just had a student, we did a study just as a kind of pilot look at their dogs' responses to different emotions. So what we did was take recordings, voice recordings, either of a human or a dog, with happy, excited vocalizations, angry, aggressive vocalizations, and distress. And the dogs completely ignored the human recordings. And I think this is all of these dogs, apart from one puppy who responded very strongly, all the rest of the dogs were over a year of age. And I think in living in a household with a television, as they all did, they just learned to blank out all kinds of recordings of human voices. Because if they're responding to the television all the time when they heard distress on the television, that's all they'd ever do.
Mm-hmm.
They just ignore it. They responded very strongly to the dogs because they're not used to hearing dogs. And they responded in ways that you would absolutely expect. So for the one with aggression, they either took an alert posture and became very stiff and tense, or they cowered away. One dog went behind its owner's legs and peeked out from behind the legs when it heard the aggression. When it was distress, they would go towards the speakers and start sniffing. And they started to move around and walk around. And when it was excitement, that was much more neutral. They either kind of ignored it or they would become excited. A few of them became excited. That wasn't such a clear one. So they did seem to be responding differently to the different emotions. I think there is definitely room to look at this more systematically.
Mm-hmm. So that's what you're wanting to do next, is kind of have a series of emotions and then see how the responses are to each of those emotions and kind of study the response. So in this experiment, the procedure is you had 20 dogs that you used, 20 different dogs.
18 dogs. Yeah, that's right. 18 different dogs.
Oh, 18.
And Yeah, we went for medium-sized dogs, mostly because we were saying, well, if they're going to come and nuzzle and lick, they need to be able to get near the face and the hands and near to the human. If we went for toy dogs, they'd have to be jumping up and the behavior becomes more complex. So we'll try and get dogs all of around about the same size. But of course, there are incredibly interesting breed differences. Toy dogs have been bred to be our companions, and their primary role, all of these kind of toy breeds, are for the companionship that they show humans. So you might expect a working breed or a guard dog breed to behave in a very different way to a toy breed. So another question to ask is, can we find breed differences? And the question I would really like to ask is, what about domesticated wolves? Is it domestication and the process of breeding, systematic breeding and domestication, that's changed the dog's responses? Or is any canine-like, the rootstock of all domestic dogs are wolves? They've not been systematically bred, but if they're raised in a dog-like way, do they also respond in a similar way? And I think that's really open to debate whether they do. I'd like to talk to owners of domesticated wolves to see if they have a sense that their wolf is showing them emotional concern or responding emotionally in the same way that a domestic dog does. Have we bred this into the dog inadvertently? Have we chosen dogs that respond to us emotionally because we bond with those dogs in a very particular way, and we then not even systematically, we just chose those dogs to be mothers and fathers of the puppies that we want, that continue to show this warm emotional response? Or is it in fact that any social animal will be able to make this accommodation across the species barrier to respond? Certainly when I was with chimpanzees, I got the sense that chimpanzees were responding to my emotions. And they're certainly not a domesticated creature, but they're genetically very similar to me. And there seemed to be an emotional connection. So what about primates or chimpanzees that have been raised by humans or have a very friendly relationship with humans? Would they respond in similar ways and show similar empathic-like responses?
Yeah,
I have lots of things I want to look at.
Yeah, it's a lot of questions, a lot of areas for future research. So it's kind of like, there's one question is, can you kind of breed select for empathic qualities and therefore raise the empathic qualities of dogs through selective breeding? You keep breeding for that trait.
Yeah.
How about the quality that there's the quality of self-recognition? For example, babies at about 2 years old, I think 18 months or up, start recognizing themselves in the mirror, as well as, chimpanzees can, elephants, dolphins, and, some other animals. And dogs, I think, don't have that. So we're talking about there's a different level of empathy that kind of goes with that sense of self-recognition. How about?
Yeah, because certainly I was very unsure what we would find with the dogs, because one of the components that you talk about in relation to empathy is a self-other differentiation. That it's not you in pain, it's the other individual. You're not just responding to your own situation and your own kind of contagiously triggered response, but you're making a differentiation from that's their pain, even if I'm echoing it somehow internally. And I'm not sure, because with dogs, of course, they're being raised by humans in a human household. And if they respond to a human who is crying, they're going to be rewarded. Most humans find that charming, and they will give the dog a lot of affection if they come over and offer what appears to be comfort. So even if they came over because they're slightly distressed and they're looking for comfort, they then get it because the human's like, aren't you sweet? And they give the dog a lot of affection. Next time a human responds in this way, they're going to go over to the human. Now, we tried to tease that apart by saying, but what if it's a stranger that's crying? But even so, the dogs could have learnt in general, any human that's crying is going to give me affection, so I'm going to go over now. I think the part of it that made it more than just that is that they went over in a certain way. They went over in this submissive, subdued way that suggested that there was a component that was more than I've just been rewarded in the past. But whether there's a self-other differentiation, I don't know how we would ever get at that. Without the dog saying, I feel your pain, and I know that you're hurting, without them, we have the advantage of language. And even with little children, even if they can't articulate why they're responding in the way they are, we make the assumption that they have this self-other differentiation because we know they're going to get there in the end. It's that problem of other minds. I can't climb into your subjective state, but you're behaving just as I would expect when I feel these things, so I assume that's what you're feeling too. Actually, objectively, completely scientifically, I can't prove that. And the only way we can get at it is convergent evidence. So if the same neuronal responses were going on for when I'm actually feeling empathy, and I know I subjectively am, and then you say you are, and it's exactly the same neuronal pattern of response, I've got more evidence to say, yes, you are actually experiencing empathy. So putting a dog in a scanner would be interesting. I'm not quite sure how you do it, but when we get to the situation, I hope in the future, where you've got individuals that can move around and you can scan their neuronal activity, then we could start looking, well, are they at least their brain activating in a way that's consistent with what we would expect for proper empathy or full-blown empathy?
Mm-hmm.
Right at the moment.
It's that, Franz de Waal has kind of the model of empathy as kind of the Russian doll model. So it's like this whole series of layers of empathy. And at some point, there's going to be a differentiation between the dog's empathy and the human empathy, the capability, and kind of teasing out all those nuances is quite interesting.
Yeah. And rather than it being an absolute either or, because some people tend to, they define empathy in such a way that it automatically excludes other species from being able to show it. So it needs full-blown theory of mind. Well, I don't think there's very much evidence that dogs have a full-blown theory of mind. They show very surprising social cognition. The work of Brian Hare and his team have shown that dogs can do some social cognitive tasks beyond what a chimpanzee can do. But whether they can do things like pass false belief tests and show this kind of level, and they don't pass the mirror recognition test, you start saying, well, no, I don't think they're going to show what Franz de Waal calls cognitive empathy, this complete understanding of a different mindset from their own. But if you don't think about it as just being either or, and you think about it as a continuum, saying, well, our ability must have come from somewhere. What are the components that would have led to the point where, yes, we've taken it beyond what any other species has, but does any other species come close? Does any other species cross the divide? I think of empathy as, it used to be thought, because of the problem of other minds, that we're all locked inside these bodies and these minds, completely cut off from everyone else. And what mirror neurons allow, and what empathy allows, is no, I really can feel your pain. I really can cross this barrier that's between us so that I can experience the world in a way that's very similar to you, because I can contagiously catch your physical movements, which mirror neurons show that you can respond. If you see another moving in a certain way, you also, your motor cortex activates, but also your emotions. I can cross the divide between myself and you because my mirror neurons will respond to your emotion. And that to me seems extraordinary and wonderful. I think it's the most wonderful development in psychological science in the last few years. Mirror neurons, I think, have shown something extraordinary. We are not cut off from others. We are connected to them in this extraordinary way. And perhaps with dogs, I don't know, but perhaps other species as well. We're not just cut off from other humans. We're linked to other species as well, possibly.
Yeah,
certainly we respond emotionally to them, but are they responding to us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it really shows that we are connected to others, kind of intimately connected, and then with animals, other animals, and that we're not just individualistic,
Yeah.
autonomous beings. How did you get interested in empathy? Was there like a moment you said, like an aha moment of like, this is really important. Empathy is something that's really important to me personally.
Yeah, I got interested way back when I started my PhD, because there were a number of things that the very early comparative psychologists talked about as being extraordinarily human, and asking, do other species show it? And they're all to do with this connection across organisms. So I started with imitation, where you can, in a way, catch the behavior of other individuals. Um, and so I remember watching the movie E.T., and the moment that you know that the alien is special is one where the little boy Elliot scratches his forehead and the alien reaches up and does the same thing, and you know there's a meeting of the minds.
Mm.
And that to me was what was really important about imitation, is it's a way for me to go, you're like me, but you're not me. It's all about this self-other divide. And I was interested in that way back when I started studying psychology. I started as a philosopher. That's my main interest. And I was interested in the philosophy of mind. And so they talked about things like empathy, and they talked about symbolism, how you use symbols in order to talk about things that are present and distant, and imitation, pretense, this ability to act as if something's there when it's not there, and then invite you to engage in that. So that if you know that a child's made this landmark step when they offer you tea from a cup that's not present, and then you engage by taking it and doing that too, and all of a sudden there's a meeting of the minds. You've crossed the divide. And it was those things that got me interested. So empathy is always something which I've been interested in, but thought I could never empirically study in other species. I've always been interested in where's the divide between humans and other species. And then suddenly it just struck me one day. We'd done the work with the dog-human bond using Ainsworth's strange situation test, which is a classic psychology test. And of course, knowing lots of the psychology tests, I knew about Zane Waxler's empathy test, where mothers pretended to cry. And it just struck me, oh my goodness, we can do it with dogs. I can actually finally study empathy in a more systematic way. And that was my aha moment.
So it sounds like just connection is important to you. It's like how people connect, and
Absolutely. How do we can either think of ourselves in the kind of selfish gene framework, that we're just these machines, that we're just here programmed to reproduce. It's a very lonely, locked off way. Or we have, and I think to a certain extent, the problem of other minds is a true philosophical problem. I cannot climb into your mind. I cannot experience things exactly as you are. I have to make these assumptions and inferences. You look like me, you're behaving like me. And then it suddenly struck me with mirror neurons. Actually, no, I can really, in a very real way, capture what you're experiencing, because I have these mechanisms that allow me to cross that divide, so that when I'm feeling empathy and this emotional response, I've actually been evolved to cross the divide. I have these neuronal systems that I've come into the world with so that I can respond in this way. I mean, we find dolphins have a way of communicating so that they respond to each other in the way that they move. So Herman in Hawaii has done some gorgeous work about, they just do a signal to the dolphins that says copy. And they don't say what the dolphins have to do. And somehow the dolphins are able to communicate so that they can respond with the same flip or the same movement. There'll be two dolphins together. And so you're finding other species that are tuned in a way that really, for me, shows we're not cut off. We've evolved not to be cut off. It's really important we're not, because we have to work closely with each other in these incredibly important social relationships and working out the mechanisms that connect us in a very, very real way. It's not all dry and cognitive. I mean, that's why I don't like the term cognitive empathy, because it kind of empties empathy of the emotional connection, because it makes it sound as if it's all about thinking. And it's not. It's about feeling. The beating heart, I think, in empathy is how you're responding emotionally. And if you're not truly responding emotionally, I'm not sure you're truly showing empathy.
Yeah. So the cognitive empathy, I don't like the word either, and I use imaginative empathy. Like I have my definition, I see like 4 parts to empathy. It's like a self-empathy, so it's like self-connection to what's going on in myself, because you have to be able to read, feel, with that sensory awareness of what's going inside of yourself, and to kind of tune into that. And that kind of opens me up to what I would call mirrored empathy, which is the picking up of the reflection through mirror neurons. And then instead of cognitive empathy, and sometimes called perspective taking, I think imaginative empathy, you're kind of like imagining those experiences. So you're kind of using those same mirror neuron experiences, but through an imaginative process, which you were saying you really liked with the child, imagining, And then the 4th part is empathic action, that as we connect with each other, that we take kind of the response that we would kind of take for ourselves to not just empathic concern, but if someone's having fun, if they're being creative, we want to accentuate their creativity and their fun. If they're in distress, we want to kind of alleviate that distress. So it's really across the spectrum of taking kind of appropriate action that we would do for ourselves, because we're really connected as kind of like one.
Yeah, that makes a lot. Actually, as you were speaking, it reminds me of some of the things that people talk about in the field of positive psychology, about being open or closed. And they were saying when you're in a threat situation, what you do is you close your creativity and you close your connections because you're being threatened. And so you're closing others out. When you're in a positive situation and a positive frame of mind, you open to other people and you can respond to them. And I can see there in those situations you can show empathy. So if you find that empathy goes down significantly in situations where people feel threatened, so times of conflict, you find that people, or where you're being bludgeoned again and again by very threatening situations, you start to switch off to other people because you're just looking after yourself. If you're in a situation where you're not being threatened, you can respond more. You have more chance to respond openly to other individuals. So I'm very interested in positive psychology, because psychology usually looks always at the negative. We're always looking at illness and psychological illness, and positive psychology talks about, well, how do we promote health? And empathy is a way in which I think it is a very healthy response. It's a way in which you have to have this strong situation for yourself to be able to respond empathically to others. And I think you can train it, because I think that's what you're seeing in the dogs. The dogs are being encouraged. This basic, empathic, contagious response that they have is being shaped by humans, so that they are then responding in a way that we recognize. But of course, that's exactly what we're doing with our children. So not only are we responding in a positive way to our dogs when they come over, when somebody's distressed, we absolutely doing it with our children. They get lots of praise if they show any kind of concern.
Yeah, there's a quality I think that's really is the fear component that, we're talking about what actually, well, I'm in a kind of a larger context. I'm interested in how do we build a culture of empathy. It's like, how do we raise the level of empathy within society? And actually, I feel that we need to, at a worldwide level, raise empathy to be like perhaps the primary social value, because for me, it's like the social glue that holds the society together. So that's why I'm doing these interviews and these dialogues to, kind of shed more light and start a dialogue about it. So,
Yeah.
yeah, so we're talking about okay, if we want to build a culture of empathy, it's like, what are the blocks to empathy? And it seems like one of the number one blocks, what you're just talking about, is fear. That as we become afraid, we shut down. So it's a matter of, and I would be really interested in knowing what is really happening when we shut down, because it's almost as if our body kind of constricts the cells, the muscles, and we kind of shut off empathy, and we're ready to fight not have empathy for wherever the threat is. We shut down our empathy for the threat. And so that whole mechanism of what's kind of going on there is really quite fascinating. And what can we do in reverse to actually nurture empathy and expand empathy? And so I don't know if you have ideas about what the kind of steps that we can do to build a culture of empathy.
Well, out of my own kind of, it's not directly related to my field, but of course in social psychology, they've shown situations where people are either in a city, which is very threatening, and they see somebody in distress, versus in a smaller community, a familiar small community, and they're much more likely to respond to another's distress when they're in the safety of their own familiar community. In a city, myself, I'm in London, and there are times where I would see another in distress and I would not respond because it would be dangerous. And I'm frightened, I'm going to be hurt. And Frans de Waal talks a lot about that he thinks we've evolved to be in small, familiar communities. It's our psychological kind of heritage. And if we want to create healthy societies, we need to create community spirit. People need to get to know their neighbours. They need to get to care about the people living immediately in their neighbourhood. We tend to be very itinerant. We're always moving around one place to the other. We don't get to know the people immediately around us. I think more that we can do to connect socially to the people around us, the more we'll start to care about them. Whether we can take that to a global level, well, certainly some people can. It must be able to be done because there are people that show incredible concern for people they have never met, and yet they can make that imaginative leap. But it must start, I would imagine. Some of it's going to be personality. I think some of it's going to be your basic wiring, but a lot is going to be your experience and what you learn that you can effectively do from a place of safety. And I think that's what the dogs are doing. They're learning to respond in these ways because it's being nurtured in the household. So it'd be really interesting to look at dogs that are not raised like children in a household, but are working dogs. I bet anything those dogs will not respond in the same way because they've got a job to work to do. They don't have those types of relationships. So that's the other thing we'd like to look at is which dogs will show this response. We tested pets. Beloved pets. I would like to do guard dogs. I'd like to do dogs that have a job of work to do and see, can we knock this response out of them? Can we raise them in such a way where they don't respond in this way? I think that would be really interesting in terms of saying, how do we build an empathic individual? What experiences do they need to respond in a way that's consistent with empathy?
So what is is this going to be kind of like a focus of your work now, is continuing these studies, and it's
I would love to do more of it. I think there's loads more to be done. There's lots of questions. I would love to have a look at chimpanzees, primates were my first love, although I've always loved dogs. But I would like to look at it in other species. But there's so much to do with dogs. And there's so much more that you can control and look at with dogs. So I would very much like to do that. I think there's more work that could be done with children, looking at the development. If you can see that these processes are happening in household dogs, where some of them show a response and some don't, Maybe that's their learning history. I think you could go back and start looking at children and saying, well, there'll be individual differences in children and how they respond. Certainly the original work that Zane Wexler and other developmental psychologists did showed that there was a strong correlation between the degree to which children were praised for showing empathy, and this was done by diary studies with parents taking a note of what their children were doing, and then in the actual experimental test, the degree to which they responded. It seemed if parents were very invested in encouraging empathy-like responses, hey presto, their children showed more empathy-like responses. It'd be really nice to see, well, is that mirrored in their physiological responses? Are they actually becoming upset in terms of, you can see that they're physiologically upset, so that you're tapping to a very basic system through learning history? So these kinds of questions are what I'm beginning to think about.
A lot of questions. Yeah, there's a lot of questions there, a lot of work. Sounds like a lifetime's worth of work ahead of you.
Yes.
On this. But I think this is a real interesting theme because, you know, I've had the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy. I've created all these different causes on, you know, Facebook, and there's empathy for animals. You know, let's find 1 million people to build a culture of empathy, empathy in nature, empathy in children. And the cause that had the most interest was empathy for animals.
Really?
It's like I think it has like 26,000 people have signed up, and empathy in general only has like 16,000. So it's like people love their animals and their pets, you know, because it's something that they have such a real bond with. So there's a lot of interest around this topic.
Absolutely. I was very surprised by the amount of interest that I got from very ordinary everyday dog owners that have been writing, asking about the research. I don't suppose I should have been that surprised, because people absolutely love the emotional relationship that they have with their dog. They're not judged by them. The dog responds to them in a way that's very positive, and people are very bonded to them. It's a very pure emotional relationship. So I'm not surprised that that people respond that way. And certainly some of the studies have shown that if young children show a lack of empathy towards animals, and actually more than that, if they show cruelty towards animals, that you have real cause for concern when they become adults. So the degree to which children can show empathy, not just for other humans, but make the imaginative leap across species, is, I think, a real test paper to how they're going to be as adults. I mean, the classic group that don't show empathy are sociopaths and psychopaths. And nearly always in their case reports, there's evidence that when they were young, that particularly young psychopaths, that they have tortured and hurt animals. So this lack of empathy for another species, it's very interesting that we know that there's a group of our society where they might cognitively understand empathy. That's why I don't like the term cognitive empathy. They understand when they're supposed to be feeling these things. They just don't feel it. And so I'm not very surprised that people are so interested in the animal case. I think we should be encouraging society to look at the other end of the spectrum. People tend to show empathy for animals and for children. What perhaps is less shown is empathy for old people, but we're living in the Western world in a society where we are an aging population, and we've got to start showing empathy for older people, because it's going to be a major social concern. It already is, but it's going to increase. So it'd be quite interesting to see how people feel towards old age and the empathy that they show to older people.
Well, okay. I hope we can keep this conversation going. I'm also doing panel discussions, so if you're knowing some other researchers who would like to take some, slice of this and kind of explore it in more depth, would love to do that and kind of keep the conversation going. Because it's been absolutely wonderful to chat with you about this, and enjoy your enthusiasm and passion for this topic and insights as well.
I've really enjoyed this. It's been really, really interesting talking with you. Yeah, I'd be stay in touch, and yeah, I'd be very interested to see what other people you're talking to.
Okay, then great. Thank you so much for this hour-long discussion on your study and the topic of empathy.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
It was lovely to have met you. Bye then, Edwin.
Bye, Debbie. Take care.
Okay, bye.
See the world through other people's eyes. Empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.